Dear listeners, in this close reading session, I'll be reading through the recapitulation of sections 4 and 5, and from there on continuing on through sections 6 through 8. In the reading we did in the last session, Heidegger discussed mostly his methodological understanding of what he is going to do during the lectures, and he also made some first steps towards explaining what this means with regard to the question of truth. And in short, we found that Heidegger thinks that we should not get rid of the tradition, but ask the question of truth without being restrained by the way that this question has been asked by the tradition. So asking a basic question is more about trying to reach an attitude that is unencumbered by the 2000 years of Western philosophy that has shaped the way that the question has been asked in the past. In the reading for today, we will go one step further, and namely in the sense that we will hear more about what it is exactly that we should move beyond, or first of all, think about in a more open way regarding truth and logic. I will now read the recapitulation. Recapitulation. Section 1. The question of truth as the most necessary philosophical question in an age that is totally unquestioning. If we try to determine the present situation of man on this earth metaphysically, thus not historiographically and not in terms of worldview, then it must be said that man is beginning to enter the age of the total unquestionableness of all things and of all contrivances. That is truly an uncanny occurrence, whose orientation no one can establish and whose bearing no one can evaluate. Only one thing is immediately clear. In this completely unquestionable age, philosophy, as the questioning that calls forth what is most worthy of questioning, becomes inevitably most strange. Therefore, it is the most necessary, and necessity has its most powerful form in the simple. The simple, however, is our name for what is inconspicuously the most difficult, which, when it occurs, appears to everyone immediately and ever again as the easiest and most accessible, yet it remains incontestably the most difficult. The simple is the most difficult, for the multiple admits and favor dispersion, and all dispersion as a counter-reaction to the unification of man in his constant flight from himself, that is, from its relation to being itself, confirms and thereby alleviates and releases the heavy burden of existence. The multiple is the easy, even where concern over it seems toilsome. For progress from one thing to another is always a relaxation, and it's precisely this progress that is not allowed by the simple, which presses on instead to a constant return to the same in a constant self-enrichment. Only if we risk the simple do we arrive within the arena of the necessary. What is most necessary in philosophy, supposing that it must again become the strangest, is precisely that simple question by which it, in its questioning, is first brought to itself, namely the question of truth. These two paragraphs contain a lot of ideas that can only be understood in their essence when we've gone through a lot more of the book. So just to pick out two things that might be interesting and useful here to discuss. First of all, the idea that the simple is the most difficult, and that it is not something that people in our times are comfortable with or deal with on a daily basis. Heidegger's analysis of our times is that most people are fully preoccupied with beings and the world in a way that is only concerned with an effective way of shaping our daily lives. And this way of shaping our lives and dealing with the world is, Heidegger also believes, usually determined by his striving for ever more efficient ways of dealing with the lives. And the combination between, on the one hand, being fully preoccupied with the world and striving for efficiency leads to an inability to see the value of questioning and see the value of standing still. Because once you're standing still, you're not moving efficiently and making the world and your lives better. For this reason, Heidegger says that we live in an unquestionable age, an age that has lost sight of the value of asking questions that do not have a direct bearing on the efficient world. And on the other hand, we cannot reach the simple, because the simple is so utterly different from the daily present at hand objects that allow for calculation and manipulation. So what Heidegger is saying here is that we live in an age that has lost the ability to ask questions that go beyond the narrow relation to ourselves and the world that has been established within the modern technological world. Moving on. 2. What is worthy of questioning in the determination of truth hitherto? Truth as correctness of an assertion, as compelling us towards the question of truth. The question of truth, as it has been raised hitherto, is a problem of logic. If from this problem, that is, from the moribund question, a living question is to arise, and if this is not to be an arbitrary and artificial, but necessary in an original way, then we have to strive for a genuine experience of what is compelling us towards the question of truth. The determination of truth up to now, and still valid everywhere in the most varied trappings, runs as follows. Truth is the correctness of a representation of a being. All representing of beings is a predicating about them, although this predication can be accomplished silently and does not need to be pronounced. The most common form of predication is the assertion, the simple proposition, the logos, and therefore the correctness of representation, truth, is to be found there in the most immediate way. Truth has its place and seat in logos. The more precise determination of truth then becomes the task of a mediation on logos, a task of logic. What can now compel us to turn the usual definition of truth as correctness of representation into a question? This can indeed only be the circumstance, perhaps still hidden, that the unquestioned determination of truth as correctness contains something worthy of questioning, which by itself requires being put into question. It could be objected that not everything questionable needs to be made the object of a question. Perhaps, therefore, we want to examine whether and to what extent there is in the usual determination of truth as correctness something worthy of questioning in the first place, and whether, furthermore, it is of such a kind that we cannot pass over it unheeded and unquestioned, supposing that we claim to be informed about the truth in accord with others and with ourselves. The remarks that Heidegger makes here are in line with the argument that I ended that last close reading session with. Asking a basic question with regard to truth is not so much about completely rejecting the traditional understanding of truth as the correctness of an assertion, but it's first about looking whether there is something hidden which has remained unasked. And this is going to be the first central question that Heidegger will deal with, namely, what is the traditional understanding of truth exactly, and are there levels or aspects of it that remain mysterious, even though it has been the basis of philosophy and especially logic for 2,500 years. Continuing on with section 6. 6. The traditional determination of truth as correctness. We say that an assertion, or the knowledge embedded in it, is true insofar as it conforms to, in German sich richten nach, its object. Truth is correctness, and which is called in German Richtigkeit. In the early modern age, though above all in medieval times, this rectitudo was also called adequatio, adequation, assimilatio, assimilation, or convenientia, correspondence. These determinations revert back to Aristotle, with whom the great Greek philosophy comes to its end. Aristotle conceives of truth, which has its home in logos, assertion, as homoiosis, assimilation. The representation, in Greek noema, is assimilated to what is to be grasped. The representational assertion about a hard stone, or representation in general, is of course something pertaining to the soul, psyche, something spiritual. At any event, it is not the type of the stone. Then how is the representation supposed to assimilate itself to the stone? The representation is not supposed to and cannot become stone-like, nor should it, in the corresponding case of an assertion about a table, become woody, or in representing a stream become liquid. Nevertheless, the representation must make itself similar to the being at hand, that is, as representing, it must posit the encountered before us and maintain it as so posited. The representing and the positing before, that is, the thinking, conforms to the being as to let it appear in the assertion as it is. Heidegger gives here a general account of the traditional understanding of truth, and he somewhat explains what it means when we say that truth is the correctness of an assertion. So he gives some examples. If we assert that the stone is hard, then the asserting, the propositional content of the sentence that I spoke should conform to the stone that it is about. So an assertion on the side of the mind or the soul is true if it corresponds to the external world. And this general structural account of truth has been called differently throughout history. For instance, homoiosis with the Greeks, adequatio in medieval times, and in modern times correspondence. With this general account, we can now move on to see whether there is something mysterious or unquestioned hidden within this understanding of truth. And this is what Heidegger is going to do in the section that I will be reading now. The relation of a representation to an object is the most natural thing in the world. So much so that we are almost ashamed to still speak explicitly of it. Therefore, the naive view, not yet tainted by epistemology, would not be able to see what is supposed to be incorrect or even merely questionable in the determination of truth as correctness. Admittedly, throughout the many endeavors of man to attain the knowledge of beings, it often happens, unfortunately, that we do not grasp beings as they are and are deluded about them. But even delusions occur only where the intention prevails of conforming to beings. We can delude others and take them in only if the others, just as we ourselves, are in advance in an attitude of conforming to beings and aiming at correctness. Correctness is the standard and the measure even for incorrectness. Thus, the determination of truth as correctness, together with its counterpart, namely incorrectness, falsity, is in fact clear as day. Because this conception of truth emerges, as is obvious, entirely from the natural way of thinking and corresponding to it, it has lasted throughout the centuries and has long ago been hardened into something taken for granted. Truth is correctness, or, in the more visual formula, truth is the correspondence of knowledge, representation, thought, judgment, assertion with the object. There are two important things to stress regarding the passages that we just read. First, Heidegger's aim here is to show how the self-evidentness of the understanding of truth as the correctness of an assertion stands in the way of asking a basic question and might be the reason why in the tradition of Western philosophy there hasn't been, according to what Heidegger believes, no true basic questioning of this understanding of truth. It is just too obvious that if one makes a statement about something, then it is true if it conforms to that object. There's just no question to ask here. And this is why Heidegger also says that it has lasted throughout the centuries and has long been hardened into something taken for granted. So the obviousness and the fact that it's been taken for granted for so long has made it pretty impossible to ask a true basic question on the basis of this understanding of truth. And secondly, but not as important, is the fact that when Heidegger says that truth and falsity belong together, essentially, he's already giving something away that is going to be very important later on. And especially when he adds that he also sees that making true statements and also being misled by the world or by people is only possible in relation, or when we stand in a specific relation to truth, namely in an open space in which truth is able to reach us in the first place. That's also going to be very essential. But I'm not going to go into that in much more detail because that will not be helpful here. And now we're continuing with section 7. 7. The controversy between idealism and realism on the common soil of a conception of truth as the correctness of a representation. To be sure, in the course of time, objections arose against this conception of truth. These objections were based specifically on doubt as to whether our representations reached the being itself in itself at all and did not rather remain enclosed within the circuit of our own activity, hence in the realm of the soul, the spirit, consciousness, the ego. Surrender to this doubt leads to the view that what we attain in our representing is always only something represented by us, hence it is itself a representation. Consequently, knowledge and assertion consist in the representation of representations, and hence in a combination of representations. This combining is an activity and a process taking place merely in our consciousness. The adherents of this doctrine believe that they have critically purified and surpassed the usual determination of truth as correctness. But this belief is mistaken. The doctrine that knowledge relates only to representations, the represented, merely restricts the reach of a representation, yet it still claims that this restricted representation conforms to the represented and only to the represented. Thus, even here a standard or measure is presupposed to which the representing conforms. Even here truth is conceived as correctness. On the last paragraph we can be very brief because the main argument is going to follow in the next one. Here Heidegger is only establishing the basis, and the basis here is that even though in the tradition there has been a critique of the traditional concept of truth, the critique itself doesn't go beyond the idea that truth is the correctness of a representation. It merely doubts or uses doubt as to whether our representations reach the world in itself to undermine it without going beyond it. So Kant, for instance, is one of the main examples, saying that we cannot reach the world as it is in itself, but that truth is still the correctness of a mental state or a mental representation of the world, that because of its mental structure or mental nature has a restricted reach. So, in short, even though the traditional concept of truth, understood as the correctness of an assertion, hasn't been accepted throughout the Western tradition unilaterally, the rejections merely limit the reach of our representations and not the way truth itself is conceived. And now moving on to the main argument, by which Heidegger tries to show that realism and idealism both rely on the understanding of truth as the correctness of an assertion. The doctrine that the representations relate only to the represented, the perceptum, the idea, is called idealism. The counterclaim, according to which our representations reach the things themselves, the res, and to what belongs to them, the realia, has been called, ever since the advance of idealism, realism. Thus, these hostile brothers, each of whom likes to think himself superior to the other, are unwittingly in complete accord with regard to the essence, that is, with regard to what provides the presupposition and the very possibility of their controversy, that the relation to beings is a representing of them and that the truth of the representations consists in its correctness. A thinker such as Kant, who founded idealism and strictly adheres to it, and who has most profoundly thought it through, concedes in advance that the conception of truth as correctness of a representation, as correspondence with the object, is inviolable. Realism, for its part, is captive to a great error when it claims that even Kant, the most profound idealist, is a witness for the defense of realism. On the contrary, the consequence of Kant's adherence to the traditional determination of truth as correctness is simply the opposite, namely that realism, in its determination of truth as correctness of a representation, stands on the same ground as idealism, and is even itself idealism according to a more rigorous and more original concept of idealism. For even according to the doctrine of realism, the critical and the naive, the res, beings, are attained by means of the representation, the idea. Idealism and realism therefore comprise the two most extreme basic positions as regards the relation of man to beings. All past theories concerning this relation and its character, truth as correctness, are either one-sided caricatures of the extreme positions or derive variations on the numerous mixtures and distortions of the two doctrines. The controversy among these opinions can still go on endlessly without ever leading to genuine reflection or to an insight, because it has its characteristics of this sterile wrangling to renounce in advance the question of the soil upon which the combatants stand. In other words, the conception of truth as correctness of representation is taken for granted everywhere, in philosophy just as in extra-philosophical opinion. The more obvious and the more unquestioned the unusual determination of truth, the simpler it has to be what is worthy of questioning in this determination, supposing something of the sort is indeed concealed therein. Yet, the more simple what is worthy of questioning proves to be, the more difficult it will be to grasp this simple in its inner fullness, that is, to grasp it simply and unitarily as what is worthy of questioning, that is, perplexing, and to adhere to it in order to unfold its proper essence and thus pose it back upon its hidden ground. Okay, so now we are making a very important step. First, he discussed what exactly the traditional understanding of truth is, and now he's saying, yeah, well, even though people have been critical of the traditional understanding of truth, the way they critiqued it was not to critique it on its basis, namely that truth is the correctness of an assertion, but merely on the reach of the representational relation that man is able to have to the world. And out of this discussion of the reach of our representational capabilities arose two important positions, namely realism and idealism. Now, according to the realists, man is able to reach the world as it is in itself. So, if he makes a propositional statement, he's able to confirm whether the statement is true by relating it to the world. And we have access to the world, so we're able to determine whether our representation or our assertion was correct. The idealist opposes this and says that we are unable to reach the world as it is in itself. So if we make a statement, we can only determine its correctness by relating it to mental representations that have no bearing on the world as it is in itself. So while for the realist truth is something about the world in itself, the idealist has the position in which truth is only able to exist within the immanent realm of consciousness without being able to go outside it. And now comes the interesting part, because Heidegger says this is all well and good, but what we see here is that both positions adhere completely to the idea that correctness lies in the truth of an assertion and its relation to what it's about. The one says that man can establish that relation and the other says that it can't, insofar as the assertion is about something external. And to quote from the passage we just read, Heidegger says, "The controversy among all opinions can still go on endlessly without ever leading to genuine reflection or an insight. And so it's up to us to go beyond this traditional controversy and start asking the question of the ground of truth," which is going to be the main topic of section 8, which I'll be reading now. 8. The space of the fourfold unitary openness, the first directive toward what is worthy of questioning in the traditional determination of truth as correctness. We must now seek a first directive toward what is worthy of questioning here, in order to secure our questioning in general and, even if only preliminary, assure ourselves of its legitimacy. Let us reflect. If a representation and assertion, for example the statement "the stone is hard," are supposed to conform to the object, then this being, the stone itself, must be accessible in advance, in order to represent itself as a standard and measure for the conformity with it. In short, the being, in this case the thing, must be out in the open. Even more, not only must the stone itself, in order to remain with our example, be out in the open, but so must the domain which the conformity with the thing has to traverse in order to read off from it, in the mode of representing what characterizes the being in its being thus and so. Moreover, the human who is representing, and who in his representing conforms to the thing, must also be open. He must be open for it encounters him, so that it might encounter him. Finally, the person must also be open to his fellows, so that, co-representing what is communicated to him in their assertions, he can, together with the others, and out of a being with them, conform to the same thing and be in agreement with them about the correctness of the representing. Incorrectness of the representational assertion here holds sway, consequently a fourfold openness: 1 of the thing, 2 of the region between thing and man, 3 of man himself with regard to the thing, and 4 of man to fellow men. So, if we completely step back from the understanding that truth is the correctness of an assertion and ask what allows us to ask the question whether a stone is hard and to determine whether it's true or not, then we come to the conclusion that the stone must be accessible for us. If the stone did not appear as it is, then we would not be able to make assertions about it. So the appearance of stone is a precondition of making correct statements about it. And this can be taken one step further, because if we want to make an assertion about it, then we must be present to ourselves. If we did not experience ourselves and experience the experience of the stone, then that would also mean that we would be unable to make any statements whatsoever. And then Heidegger takes it one step further, because if someone that I'm standing next to makes a statement about the stone saying that it is hard, then we must be within the same world for me to be able to check it or to see the stone in the first place. So we must be within a shared experiential realm to be open to the assertions that other people make about the world. By the simple reflection of what is required for making correct assertions about the world, Heidegger comes to the idea that there must be a fourfold openness in which men and fellow men must be together for them to make correct statements about the world. This fourfold consists of 1. The thing, 2. The region between thing and man, 3. Of man himself with regard to the thing, and 4. Of man to fellow man. In the last 2 paragraphs of this section, Heidegger is going to expound more on this idea of the fourfold openness, and I will continue reading this now. This fourfold openness would not be what it is and what it has to be if each of these opennesses were separately encapsulated from the others. This fourfold openness holds sway rather once and unitary, and in its compass every conformity to and every correctness and incorrectness of representing come into play and maintain themselves. If we attend to this multiple and yet unitary openness, then with one stroke we find ourselves transported into another realm beyond correctness and its concomitant representational activity. This multiple unitary openness holds sway in correctness. The openness is not first produced by the correctness of the representing, but rather just the reverse. It is taking over as what was always already holding sway. Correctness of representation is only possible if it can establish itself in this openness, which supports it and vaults it over. The openness is the ground and the soil and the arena of all correctness. Thus, as long as truth is conceived as correctness, and correctness itself passes unquestioned, that is, as something ultimate and primary, this conception of truth, no matter how long a tradition has again and again confirmed it, remains groundless. But as soon as the openness, as the possibility and the ground of correctness comes into view, even if unclearly, truth conceived as correctness becomes questionable. In summation, in this close reading session we've made the following steps. First of all, we saw the traditional determination of truth as the correctness of an assertion based on the representing of an object. From there, Heidegger discussed the realism-idealism debate with the aim of showing that even though people have disagreed about truth in the tradition of philosophy, this disagreement did not reach the fundamental soil on which the understanding of truth is grounded. And then in the final section, Heidegger poses a simple but very essential reflection on what is required for any true assertion to be able to be made by a human being. And what he tries to show is that any kind of asserting is indebted to an openness in which humans, things, and world are able to be understood and experienced by us. With the openness as the main directive for the rest of the lecture course, Heidegger is going to explore how and why this hasn't been seen in the tradition of the West, and whether some aspects of the traditional understanding of truth, especially within Greek thought, has in it some hidden pathways that might help to understand what this openness is exactly. With these remarks, I would like to conclude this close reading session. In the next session, we will be finishing the preliminary part, and it will be still in the same format, even though I'm thinking of continuing after having done the preliminary part in a different format, since doing the whole book in this way will take up a lot of time and will be somewhat inaccessible simply because it takes a vast amount of time to listen to it, so I might be more selective in what I read and the way I do it. But this is something that I'll be working on in the future. For those of you who've taken the time to listen to everything that I've posted until here, I hope you enjoyed it and that it helped you in understanding Heidegger. Good luck with everything, stay well, and see you soon.